the Children's Defense Fund, as most of you know, some of you are familiar faces I've presented before, releases an annual Kids Count data book. And this year we released the data book in Minneapolis at the end of October. And the theme is around budgeting for better child outcomes. So we're really focusing on family economic stability and what happens when children aren't able to have access to their basic needs and opportunities for them to thrive. And so I'll present about the data. You know, during the presentation, any questions or comments that you have, please feel free. I'd like to, have a little bit of dialogue, hear a little bit more about what's going on in your local community. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about some of our legislative initiatives, which are, one of our priorities is improving family economic stability, and relevant to many of a lot of your work is we hope to fully fund the Child Care Assistance Program this legislative session so that all children have access. As you know, there's long waiting lists, particularly in Hennepin County. So we'll talk a little bit about that and some of our other priorities. Before I get into the data though, while I'm talking about Children's Defense Fund, I want to make sure everyone was able to get a data book. The Minnesota data book has this picture on the front, and then the other data books are national reports from the Annie Casey Foundation. So I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. So do feel free to get up and get those the data book, and then any county fact sheets. So the Children's Defense Fund is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We don't seek or accept any government funds, so we're fully funded by private donations, and today is Give to the Max Day, so if you feel so inclined to donate to CDF, I know there's a lot of other organizations out there, but that's an opportunity. And we're also funded by grants primarily from Minnesota foundations. But we're a national organization, and we have 13 state and regional offices across the country. And then our national office is out in DC, and we're founded by Marian Wright Edelman, a pretty well-known civil rights activist who worked alongside Dr. Martin Luther King on his Poor People campaign right before she founded the Children's Defense Fund 40 years ago. And she's still our president and CEO, and she works very hard and travels the country to promote policies and programs that support children. And so our mission is up here. It's really long and has a bunch of starts, but basically we want to ensure that children have everything they need in childhood so that they're able to become successful adults. And we know that that is important not only to the child and their family, but to our community as a whole, because children are our future, and they're going to be filling the roles of some very, very big shoes of our booming older generation. And so at Children's Defense Fund Minnesota specifically, we work on kind of in 4 areas. So first and foremost, we're a legislative advocacy organization, so we go to the state capitol and advocate on behalf of children and families for programs and policies that improve their outcomes. And so we typically focus on early childhood, health care, child care, overall issues of child well-being, and then economic security. And then we also do some youth leadership programs. We have Freedom School programs, which are summer and after-school literacy programs primarily focused on Black and Latino youth in the metro area. And the curriculum is culturally relevant and helps them fall in love with reading and also contribute to their community. And it's been proven very effective. More than 90% of the students in the program either are reading better by the end or have maintained their reading level over the summer, which we know is a time where a lot of students, particularly low-income students, lose some of their academic gains they made in the previous year. And we just have opened a Freedom School in Brooklyn Center. And so in Osseo, we also have a Freedom School, so we're moving out into the suburbs, and we're excited about that, because right before that, we were in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And then we also do young advocate leadership training for 18 to 30-year-olds to learn how to become child advocates. And then we do a scholarship called Beat the Odds, which is will be given to 5 high school seniors who have overcome tremendous obstacles, including poverty, homelessness, abuse, and neglect, to become successful adults. And so our Beat the Odds celebration will be this spring, and we also expanded that scholarship. It used to just serve students who lived in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but we are serving the metro area now. And then the closest we get to direct service, we don't work directly with families, are our outreach initiatives. Some of you may be familiar with Bridge to Benefits. It's online eligibility screening tool for work support programs and tax credits. So it connects families really easily to programs like medical assistance, SNAP, WIC, child care assistance, the school meal program. It's a streamlined process for them to figure out if they're eligible and how to apply. And I'll talk a little bit about it later. And there's opportunities for organizations to use it with their clients, so I'll be sure to let you know. And if you're interested in more information about it, let me know. And then we also have a school breakfast initiative, which I know I spoke to some of you about, or my colleague spoke to some of you about several months ago. But we want to reduce childhood hunger by increasing participation in the school breakfast program. And then, of course, we do research and education, and that's where Kids Count falls. And Kids Count is a project of the Annie Casey Foundation, which is a national foundation based out in Baltimore. And they give a Kids Count grant to one organization in each state in order to collect data on child well-being, more than 200 indicators across the state, county, city level, in order to provide benchmarks of child well-being in local communities, and use those benchmarks as ways to advocate for policies and programs to improve child outcomes. And so the Annie Casey Foundation also publishes their own report. They do their own Kids Count report, so that's the other yellow book, and it was actually the 25th anniversary edition. So it looked at trends actually since they started Kids Count 25 years ago, and it particularly focused on trends that have improved, like the teen birth rate, access to tax credits. So it kind of focused on policy solutions that have worked in particular states or across the country, and hoping to advance those policies. So that's a good one to check out. And then they also do a couple policy briefs each year. The green one is Race for Results, which is, we were really thrilled that they did this report, particularly in Minnesota, where in their national data book, Minnesota often ranks really well in overall child well-being. We were 5th this year. Usually we're in the top 5, and that's great that we're doing better compared to other states. But when you break the data down by race and ethnicity, you really find disparities, as you all know, and you're all shaking your head. And so sometimes when the National Kids Count Data Book is released, we get concerned that we're going to forget about those children, and when we're bragging about our high ranking. And so Race for Results really dives a little bit deeper into some of the disparities across Minnesota and across the country. And then yesterday, they just released the Creating Opportunities for Families, a 2-generation approach policy report, and it talks about 2-generation approaches to improving family economic stability. So that there were some news articles about that just yesterday, and it's a brand new report, my first time giving it out. So, and then the Annie Casey Foundation also manages the Kids Count Data Center, and here locally, I manage the website, and it's an online tool to find all of this data. So it's easily accessible to you at the state, county, and city level, and the national level. And it's a pretty easy to use site. It allows you to generate custom reports, look at trends over time, compare across different counties. You can create graphs and maps and trend lines. So it's at datacenter.kidscount.org. And if you ever run into any issue using the site, or you want more information about a data point or explanation, don't hesitate to contact us. That's what we're here for. But it is nice to have it all online because it's pretty easy to use, and a lot of organizations and schools use it for grant reports and various things like that. And Minneapolis is the only city that has data available on the website due to its size, and that's the one that we're able to provide data for. But the county level, there's many indicators that have county level data. So this year's data book called Budgeting for Better Child Outcomes, we wanted to focus on economic stability and how we create that for families and the benefits of having an economically stable family for children. And so the data book starts with an introduction that talks a little bit about what is economic instability, who does it affect, and how does it affect child outcomes. And then we have 7 sections in the data book, and those sections are based on family budget items. So food, housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and other necessities for a safe standard of living. So basically all the items a family needs to meet their basic needs. And then we also added the last section on asset development, because we know while that may not be considered a basic need, we know that assets are crucial to moving a family out of economic instability and to allowing them to enjoy long-term benefits of economic stability. And so we talk a little bit about how Minnesotans are doing in developing assets and then why they're important to families in that section. And then at the end of the data book is the state level data. And we used to publish all of the county fact sheets. I did bring kind of a few of the metro area counties here today. We used to publish all of them in the back of the data book, but it was really long, and so we decided to just stick to posting them online and distributing them at events. So if you want other counties, let me know, or you can find them on our Children's Defense Fund website. And a note about the state level data, if there's a CT in the left column, that means county data is available on that. The handouts for the counties that I brought today, that's not all of the data that's available by county. Those are kind of our select indicators, ones that we know people are particularly interested in. And then this year's data book is a little different because we really wanted to bring the data to life through family stories, particularly because the family budget is so personal and it varies by family how they are able to make ends meet. And so we wanted to hear from Minnesota families not only what their struggles were in making ends meet, but also highlight some of their strengths. Because we do know, and if you have worked with low-income families are some of the best budgeters that there are around, and they really make do with their resources in a way that is beyond what a lot of higher income people can understand and even see. And I think, one thing when we released the data book in Minneapolis, one thing one of our panelists said was, we all have experienced times where we didn't have money or we didn't have enough money. But low-income families experience times where they have no money, and they really need to make do with minimal resources in order to make sure their children have what they need. And so we wanted to highlight both those struggles and those strengths. And so we gathered family stories, and also all the pictures in the data book are real Minnesota families, no more stock photos. I felt like we were getting to know those children a little bit too well. And so we asked some of our partners across the state to help connect us with those families and photos. And so these are the organizations that we thank for giving us some stories and photos. And this little boy is at the dentist at Open Door Health Center in Mankato. So just to start, to kind of provide a framework, we begin with talking about the recipe for success in childhood. So the first thing that children need, of course, are their basic needs met. But that's not the only thing that we want for our children. We need them to have opportunities to learn, grow, and explore so that they become successful in school, they're healthier later on, and they're able to thrive as children and as into adulthood. And so, of course, with the basic needs, it's those basic needs I already mentioned. And then for the opportunities to learn, grow, and explore, we know that if a low-income family is struggling to meet basic needs, it's very difficult for them to connect with these opportunities or afford these opportunities and access these opportunities. And so The ones that we mention are starting early on with prenatal care, and then when a child is born and throughout childhood, having caring and responsive adults. And it's very important in early childhood, of course, to have caring and responsive adults because of the attachment, generating a healthy attachment with adults. And then we also know with the research on adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, when children face things like poverty or violence in their home or hunger at a young age, those are called adverse childhood experiences, and they can affect brain development. But we know that caring and responsive adults can actually reverse the effect, not only mitigate and prevent those ACEs, but they can actually reverse the effects, the negative effects on brain development. And then, of course, we want children to live in safe and supportive communities, have access to high quality early education, and then once they get into school, have access to excellent schools and teachers, and enriching summer and after school programs, and then encouragement and support to enroll in post-secondary options or college or some training program so that they have access to a well-paying job. And so that's our framework as we think about what we want for children. And then when we, of course, though, the children in low-income families or children in poverty are the ones who are most at risk for not having access to basic needs or these opportunities. So this slide shows child poverty by race and ethnicity in Minnesota. And about 15% of all children in our state, or 200,000 children, are living in poverty. And these are 2012 numbers. The data book was released just a couple weeks after the 2013 numbers were out, so we do have them in the back of the data book. And we did see a slight decrease from 2012 to 2013 in the number of children in poverty. It was about 11,000 fewer children are living in poverty in Minnesota. And we see that as a positive thing, especially because since the start of the recession, we've seen a large increase in child poverty from 11.3% in 2007 to 15% in 2012. And we've just recently, even though the recovery has been going on since 2009, 2010, we've just recently started to see a decline in the poverty rates. And we really think that's because low-income families are recovering at a slower rate than higher-income families from the effects of the recession. The jobs that are coming back are lower paying, and so the families who lost their jobs during the recession often have to go for a lower paying job, and then people who are in lower paying jobs are staying there. So we're continuing to see a slower recovery for lower income families compared to higher income families. And then when you break the data down by race and ethnicity, we do see those drastic disparities, economic disparities. And with about half of our African American children living in poverty, more than a third of American Indian children living in poverty, 30% of Hispanic or Latino, 25% of our immigrant children live in poverty, and that encompasses all races and ethnicities. And then about 20% of Asian children live in poverty, whereas 8% of white children live in poverty. And one thing that we do want to note is that when you look at the numbers of children in poverty, we still see the highest number of children in poverty is white children living in poverty. But what we do know is that our demographics are rapidly shifting, and I know that's happening very quickly in your communities. And from 2000 to 2010, we saw no increase in the total number of children in our state, and that was from the census from 2000 and 2010. But what we did see is that high growth in children of color across the state, and so we saw 80% growth in the number of Hispanic or Latino children, and more than 50% growth in Black children and children of two or more races, and smaller growth in the number of Asian children, and then actually a decline in the number of white children and American Indian children. So what we're seeing is that the pie is not getting any bigger, but the pieces of the pie are shifting. And so we need to address these disparities urgently, because we know that pretty soon we're going to, the number of children in poverty white children won't be dominating that anymore, and they won't, so they're going to be in our school. They're already in our schools at a higher rate than white children, and so we have to face these disparities head on. And then the last thing I'll say about the poverty rates is we're really moving away from talking too much about the poverty rates, even though I just spent about 10 minutes talking about them. And that's because the poverty measure is really outdated, and it's widely known that it's outdated by researchers. It was created in 1964, some of you may know, by a woman at the U.S. Department of Agriculture who is charged with trying to create some measure of economic stability to look at who's in economically unstable homes. And so what she found was that a family's budget, 1/3 of their income went to food. And so she created food budgets for various household sizes and multiplied them by 3, and that's the federal poverty guidelines. It's as simple as that. Since then, it's only been adjusted for inflation. And as you may know, it's not adjusted by geography at all. So the poverty rates in the metro area are the same as in Ely, Minnesota, are the same as in San Francisco, California. It is adjusted in Alaska and Hawaii, a little bit higher, but that's the only place. And so we know that poverty is defined as $23,283 a year for a family of 4 with 2 children. And that is nowhere near what that family needs to meet basic needs anymore. And we also know that a food budget is actually about 1/7 of a family income. So it's very different than it was when the poverty guidelines were created. And so the measure is useful because it looks at trends over time. It's widely known, and people are familiar with it, but it's not to be completely disregarded or the only thing that we look at to measure family economic stability. So what we've been trying to focus more on are children in low-income families, which is twice the federal poverty guidelines, so it's about $46,000 for a family of 4 with 2 children. And we estimate that the most basic needs bare bones budget is more than $50,000 on average across this country. So even low-income families are still struggling to meet that bare bones basic needs budget that doesn't include a lot of things that are in people's budget, like debt payments or cell phone bills or any form of entertainment, transportation other than school and work. So it's a pretty bare bones budget. And so when we look at low-income families, about 1/3 of all children in Minnesota live in low-income families, or nearly 420,000 children. And then when we break it down by race and ethnicity, we see those disparities again, with nearly 3/4 of American Indian and African American children living in poverty, and 2/3 of Hispanic or Latino, and about half of all Asian children living in poverty. And so one thing we also know about children in low-income families is that they experience some of the same effects of children in poverty that happen when you live in an economically unstable household. So both the measures are important when talking about economic stability for families. And then this slide, it might be a little hard to see. I put the child poverty rates in the 7-county metro area, and they're in alphabetical order, but I'll tell you in order of the lowest to the highest rate. So Carver County had about 4.9% children living in poverty. Washington County had 6.2%, Scott County 6.5%, and then Dakota County at 9.9%, Anoka 10.7%, Hennepin 17.3%, and then about 1/4 of all children in Ramsey County live in poverty. And the arrows here are looking at trends. And so all of the counties except for Dakota County are following the statewide trend where poverty declined slightly from 2011 to 2012. None of them saw too significant of a decline, but Dakota did see a little bit of an increase. So. And when we are talking about low-income families, one thing we want to emphasize is it's really not a work issue why they don't have enough to meet basic needs. it's a wage issue. So 97% of low-income children lived in households where at least one parent worked full or part-time in the previous year. And so it's not only that low-income families want to work, they are working, and they're working hard, often for very low wages. And so this kind of shows the dilemma that low wages, that happens between low wages and a basic needs budget. The median wage for available jobs in Minnesota in the fall of 2012 was about $13 per hour. Actually, it was 2013. It's $13 per hour, but a single mother with 2 children or a single parent with 2 children needs to earn $19 an hour in order to afford just that basic needs bare bones budget. So there's a gap there that she needs to fill through work support programs or her own, budget cuts, and then oftentimes maybe the food shelf or going without food for herself or various other things that you're all familiar with that low-income families, the tough decisions they must make. And so when we look at the outcomes by poverty status in early childhood, this really shows the need for investments early in children and often in their lives, because what we're seeing is these are their outcomes as adults, and this study focused on children in poverty in early childhood. And one thing we know, when children experience poverty at younger ages, the effects are often greater and longer lasting. And we know that younger children experience poverty at higher rates. So about 17% of Minnesota children under age 6 are living in poverty, compared to 15% of children 0 to 18. And so this study looked at outcomes, these outcomes as adults. So how many years of schooling did they complete? What were their annual earnings and work hours? Did they participate in the food stamp program? Did they have poor health? Were they arrested? The data there is for men only. And then for women, did they have a non-marital birth under age 21? And when you look at below poverty, 1 to 2 times the poverty level and 2 times the poverty level, you see as even minimal income increases are able to improve some of these outcomes. So, children at 2 times the poverty level completed more schooling as adults as children who were below the poverty level. Same with having higher annual earnings, work hours, lower participation in food stamps. And then I always think the health is really striking. The children who were below poverty in early childhood and 1 to 2 times the poverty level, 13% of them had poor health, and it drops to 5% just at 2 times the poverty level. And there's been a lot more research talking about how poverty, and especially experiencing it for long term, is shaving years off of people's lives. And then the arrest rate is lower and the non-marital birth rate is lower as income increases. And you want to note that it only goes up to 2 times the poverty level. So these are, even if we can bring families' income up a little bit, we can improve these outcomes for children. And to me, this really shows, as adults, when someone enrolls in food stamps or they're arrested or they have poor health, the state and federal government pays a lot of money in remedial services for them to access health care and food stamps, and for them to be arrested. So if we were to invest in those children early on, we would save that money. The child would be healthier, more stable as adults, and more academically successful. And then, so we focused on 3 populations who are at greater risk for economic instability in the data book. And those 3 populations were children of color and American Indian children, of course, as you've already seen, children in single-parent households, and then children in families accessing the Minnesota Family Investment Program. And that program, as many of you may know, is our state's TANF program, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families is what it's called at the federal level. It's basically our welfare to work program. So I'll talk a little bit more about it and what families how families access that program. So for children of color, they face a steeper ladder to success for many reasons. And of course, being at greater risk for economic stability is one of those reasons. But there are many other barriers to success for children of color, and especially when we talk about the achievement gap, or at CDF we like to call it the opportunity gap. I don't want to say that income is the only factor that contributes to that, because that would really discredit some of the other structural barriers, structural racism, and other issues around the achievement gap. But it is one factor in contributing to it. But some of the barriers that children of color face are higher parental unemployment. You may know that we have some of the greatest disparity rates of employment for adults of color, and especially young black males of color across the country. We've had the highest unemployment rate or disparity for black men of color compared to white men. And so that's a barrier that the children experience as well. And then children of color also are living in poor, unsafe neighborhoods at higher rates. And there's been a lot more research out there recently that talks about what happens to children when they live in poor and unsafe neighborhoods. And even if the children are living in higher income families in those neighborhoods, but there's lots of concentrated poverty, they experience effects that the children who actually live in low income or poor families experience. And so that's a new kind of, and about 6% of Minnesota children live in areas of concentrated poverty. And then of course, structural racism adds to the effects of economic instability on children of color. And this graph is just the median annual income of families by race and ethnicity, and you'll see it ranges from about $75,000 a year for white families all the way down to under $30,000 for American Indian families. And then when we look at how all of these barriers to success affect children of color, if we focus on academic outcomes, because I think it is important to start looking at these, because I think Minnesota is, while it maybe took us a long time of talking about it, we are trying to really solve the achievement gap, and hopefully we'll start investing in programs and policies that are culturally relevant and proven effective to address some of these issues. But I kind of started with young children to look at the disparities that are happening in their education before they enter school, and then all the way through graduation. And so for 3- and 4-year-olds not attending preschool, overall, more than half, or 54% of all Minnesota children are not attending preschool. So that number always shocks me a little bit. So we have a lot of work to do there overall. But then of course, if you're a child of color, you're less likely to be attending preschool, with 2/3 of Hispanic children not attending preschool, nearly 60% of Asian children, and 63% of black children not attending preschool. And then once the children get into school and they're tested at 4th grade for their reading proficiency, we find that only 53% of all Minnesota children in 4th grade in 2012 were not proficient in reading. So fewer than half were proficient. And of course, the test does change from year to year, and there's various other factors, but the data is what I usually say about that. And then when you break it down by race and ethnicity, you see very high rates of black, Hispanic, and children of 2 or more races not being proficient in reading. Almost 80% of black children are not proficient in 4th grade, 77% of Hispanic children, and about 3/4 of children of 2 or more races. And of course, we know that this is an important indicator, because before 4th grade, you're learning to read. After 4th grade, you're reading to learn. And so you're going to fall further and further behind if you aren't proficient at that level. And then when we look at the graduation rates compared to other states, we really start to see some of those disparities. So I think we have a lot of bragging rights when we look at the total number of children we graduated compared to other states. We have the 3rd highest graduation rate. We have the 2nd highest for white children. But that obviously masks those disparities that we see. 88% of all children graduated in 2012. or of seniors, I should say, and it's 4-year graduation rate. But then when we break it down, 70% of African American children, 61% of American Indian, 90% of Asian children, and 67% of Hispanic children graduated in 4 years. And then you'll see the rank compared to other states. We're ranked 36th for American Indian children graduating and Asian children graduating, and 34th for Hispanic children. So we're kind of getting towards the bottom of the pack there, and we're right about in the middle for African American children at 19. And then when we look at children in single-parent homes, they face a steeper ladder to success for many reasons, the most obvious reason being that there's only one income earner. So the amount of income that they can earn is very limited. And typically, single-parent households are headed by women, and women earn less than men, even when, as we all unfortunately know, even when they have the same training or experience as men in the same occupations, they often earn less than men. But another thing too is women are often, they often go into professions that pay less than men. They're teachers and social workers and nurses' aides at higher rates. So just something to consider when you think about single parent households. And then of course when there's one adult who has to take care of the home, work, getting the kids around, getting them off to school, there are just really a lot of barriers to doing all of that, and particularly in accessing transportation and getting their kid everywhere they need to go and affording transportation, and then accessing and affording childcare, because there's no other option if they're going to work, right? There's no one to stay home, and so it's a big struggle for single parents. And you'll see that almost a third of single parent households in Minnesota live in poverty compared to 4% of married couple households. And then when we look at families accessing MFIP, a little bit more about the program that you may know, but you do have to have a child to be on, to access MFIP, and then you also get a cash benefit, and you get a food benefit, and you're typically enrolled in medical assistance as well, kind of as a package of services. And then you do have to meet pretty rigorous work requirements to participate in the program, and if you don't meet those requirements, you can get sanctioned, your benefits can get slashed. And so what we find is that the program's outcomes and kind of a lot of the investments are in that parent and getting them back to work, which we know is important and will typically improve the family's economic stability. However, the children in this program are often invisible to many services that could be available to them. Families on MFIP are connected to the county, they're connected to community services, and we're really losing an opportunity when we don't invest in the children in the program and we focus so much on the parents' work outcomes. And one statistic that really attests to that is actually 71% of all the people accessing MFIP in our state are children. And more than half of the families accessing MFIP have a child under age 6, so in that critical developmental period. And the cash grant, the maximum cash grant for a family of 3 is $532, and it hasn't been increased since 1986 for nearly 30 years. And so the fair market rent in Hennepin County is $920. So obviously there's a huge disparity between this family's basic needs and what they need, what they access through MFIP. And then of course their grant goes down as they start to work. And what a lot of people don't realize is you usually exit MFIP somewhere around 115% of the federal poverty guidelines, but you no longer receive cash at about 70%. So that benefit goes away really quickly. And it starts at that $532 for a family of 3. And only 28% of MFIP cases are accessing subsidized housing. So families somehow have to fill that gap between their cash grant, their work, and the fair market rent. And obviously that puts them at great risk for being homeless. Many families accessing MFIP are homeless. and it also puts them at great risk for living in unsafe housing conditions, crowded housing, which we know have effects on their child development. And then one outcome for children on MFIP that's pretty alarming and shows that we definitely need to be paying more attention to these children is that 1 in 3 children and families accessing MFIP are enrolled in special education, and that's nearly 3 times the rate of all other children. And so we think it's important for us to improve outcomes for children accessing MFIP. We actually did a report, I think it was released in 2010, called The Invisible Children, Children Accessing MFIP. It's a great report, and I kind of went over the high-level details of it, but you can find it on our website as well. And it was very effective in changing the conversation at the Capitol because people really didn't realize how many children were on this program and how we were ignoring their needs. So we think it's important to first and foremost increase the cash grant since it hasn't been done for nearly 30 years, improve access to high quality early education and home visiting for children on MFIP, and then continue to support parents' earning potential which is one of the main goals of the program. And of course, investing in these children now will reduce the costs of those remedial services needed later on, such as special education. And then there are other work support programs that help with the family budget dilemma and bridge that gap between low wages and basic needs. The programs that we highlight in the data book are listed here. So the Minnesota healthcare programs, SNAP, WIC, tax credits, child care assistance, energy assistance, and school meal. And each of the sections of the data book where the program fits, so the food programs, you can find a little bit more about them in the food section, et cetera. And how many families are on them and children are on them. So we know it's important for families to be enrolled in these programs because while for those of you who, if you work with any of the programs, it can be frustrating, they're difficult to apply for, there's long application processes, you have to go to 5 different agencies to get on all the programs, there's lots of barriers to accessing these programs. But even though there's a lot of things we could complain about these programs, when a family is enrolled in the programs, they do benefit them economically and improve their economic stability, and they also improve child outcomes. SNAP is often called the SNAP vaccine for children because it's been shown to improve their health and increase their school attendance. So it's very important that families are enrolled in these programs, but we know that many of them are eligible but not enrolled. And all of the programs are federal entitlement programs, meaning if you apply and you're found eligible, you can receive the benefit or access the benefit. But as you can see, 10% of children are not enrolled in the school meal program, 18% are not receiving the tax credit, 27% of families with a pregnant or breastfeeding mother or children 0 to 5 are not receiving WIC food benefits, 31% of those eligible are not enrolled in SNAP, and then about half of the uninsured in Minnesota are eligible but not enrolled in medical assistance or Minnesota Care. And of course we know that the uninsured number is getting much smaller. It's 5% overall and about 6% of children are uninsured. But when we look at this, so it might be a small number that are eligible and not enrolled in medical assistance or Minnesota Care, but it's a very high number of the uninsured. And then energy assistance and child care assistance are a little different in that they're block granted programs. So if a family applies but there's no funds left available in their county, they aren't able to get a benefit. And so we see that 70% of eligible households are not enrolled in energy assistance and 82% of income eligible children are not enrolled in child care assistance, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, we see as a huge barrier for parents to work and for children to have safe, consistent access to child care. And so one of our family stories, we took a quote from there to kind of show the barriers to accessing these programs. And so she's Beth from White Bear Lake. She's a single mother of 2. She said, I had a little job and I was struggling and I wasn't receiving child support. I had to pay for child care. I didn't have the time or the money to be able to go and get all the services and have a working vehicle to get there. I was lucky I could even get to work. So she said she was on a couple of the programs, but she just couldn't manage to get on all of them because of work and transportation and lots of barriers. And that's why we created Bridge to Benefits, which I mentioned at the beginning is a program to improve family economic stability by connecting them with work support programs. And it's a website with an online screening tool that takes about 5 minutes to complete and tells families if they're eligible for the programs that I already mentioned, connects them with how to apply, who can help them apply, and actually there's an email referral right on the site that families can send that goes directly to an organization that will call them and say, I saw you were eligible for SNAP, so Second Harvest might call them, say, you're eligible for SNAP, I can help you with the application. So they don't have to go to 15 different places and fill out all the paperwork. And we do provide free training for organizations or schools, food shelves, community clinics who are interested in using Bridge to Benefits. So if that's something you're interested in, please do let me know. But we've learned a lot from Bridge to Benefits, and it's really informed a lot of the direction of our work and this, even this data book, because we find that so many families, these programs are available to working families, and they just don't know they're eligible, and so day to day they're struggling to make ends meet. They don't think they're eligible, and so we have to ensure that they're able to access these programs, not just so it improves their economic stability, but also it means money going into our communities. Hundreds of millions of dollars spent at grocery stores, child care providers, healthcare providers. And during the recession, the Center for American Progress estimated that SNAP created or maintained 1 million jobs across the country. So these are true economic stimulators in our communities as well. And out of Bridge to Benefits, we created the Economic Stability Indicator. If you flip through the data book and you've seen some of these line graphs with blue and purple and red lines, those were produced using the Economic Stability Indicator, which is an online tool that evaluates the family budget by adding together wages, work support benefits, tax liability, and tax credits to determine if a family is able to meet basic needs. So it looks at all the resources a family has available, the expenses that they need to pay, and then what's left over at the end of the month, if anything. And so we created this tool to educate policymakers and legislators on the effects of these programs, positive and negative, also the interactions between the programs, and to demonstrate that work support programs and tax credits can bring a low-income family to some level of economic stability, but they must be accessible. So when a family can't access childcare in Hennepin County, it's going to create a huge hole in their budget, prevent them from working, and create other barriers for the family. And so the tool illustrates those difficult decisions a family must make when they are economically unstable. And so I'm just going to quickly kind of show you how to read those graphs so you can look further at each of them and evaluate the effects on family economic stability. So the programs we include are all the programs I already mentioned, and we estimate the benefit amounts on the site. And then we also do a couple more tax credits, MFIP, and Section 8 housing. And then we estimate the family expenses, and we adjust that by county as well as for what a low-income family typically would pay. And so it's all of the expenses we've been talking about: rent, food, healthcare, childcare, transportation, other necessities. And then this is where we get that data from. And then we're able to generate graphs like this. So what this graph shows, and it's also on the childcare section if you want to look closer at it in there. It's the same graph. So this is Stephanie's family pathway to economic stability. Stephanie is a single mother with a 3-year-old in Ramsey County. And as this, the horizontal axis shows as her income increases, what happens to her monthly net resources. So the monthly net resources are her estimated expense, subtract her benefit amounts. So if her food budget's $800, she gets a $200 SNAP benefit. $600 is her reduced expense. We add up all those reduced expenses, subtract them from her income, and that's how we get the monthly net resources. And we do include her tax liability too. So monthly net resources, how we think of it, is what's left over at the end of the month after her basic needs. And so what you see here is the blue line is her net resources enrolled in all programs, including Section 8 and child care assistance and energy assistance, which are very difficult for families, especially in the metro area, to access. So the blue line here, you'll see that when she's enrolled in all programs, she earns about $1,000 a month, she's able to meet her basic needs and have maybe $50 to $220 left over after those basic needs. And remember that I don't include diapers, formula, car seats, any debt payments at all. She owns a car outright is what we assume, and no student loans, no utilities besides electricity. We assume she rents. No cell phone bill, entertainment, school needs besides meals. So obviously there's going to be some other things she's going to need. That $200 is going to get spent real fast. But the programs bring her to some level of economic stability. When she hits about $4,000, you'll see her pathway to earning more and having more left over and maybe being able to save is much more linear. But what the red line shows is when she's not enrolled in the child care assistance program. And when you read this story, you'll find that Stephanie was on a wait list for 2.5 years in Ramsey County. Pretty quickly after her daughter was born, she got on the wait list. She works at a group home full-time. She got the letter 2.5 years later. She was going to be moved off the wait list. She filled out all the paperwork again, only to find out that she was like $150 over the income limits for child care assistance because she had just received a raise. And so it was very tough story to hear, and so her mom cares for her little one, and it's hard. Sometimes she has to miss work because her mom isn't very healthy, and her mom needs to go to doctor's appointments and different things, and it's obviously a burden on her mother too, who's aging and not very healthy. And so, she's thankful that she has that, but she wishes her daughter could be in a more high quality environment as well. So the other graphs show what happens when families aren't enrolled in some of the other programs as well, so you can kind of see what that looks like. So I'm just going to dive a little bit deeper into each section, and the main thing that we wanted to talk about in each of the family budget sections is that, when a family doesn't have access to all the food they need, it doesn't just affect a child's nutrition. It really has compounding effects on their development. It affects their ability to focus and their behavior in school. It affects their health, of course. And then all of those things affect their long-term outcomes. So when you think of a family not having access to food or housing, it's not as simple as just food and housing. It goes beyond that. And so I already mentioned what the research shows, the effects of hunger, especially when persistent are. And we find that 1 in 6 Minnesota children live in food insecure households. Nearly 40% are enrolled in the school meal program. 40% of infants under age 1 are enrolled in WIC. We see a huge drop-off when a child turns 1 due to paperwork and meetings that they have to attend to stay on WIC. And then also the formula benefit is very important to families, so after age 1, they don't get that anymore, of course. And then nearly 1 in 5 children are enrolled in SNAP in our state. And this graph shows the food deserts in Minnesota. So, a food desert is a area where there's very little access. It's it's a concentrated low-income area with very little access to a grocery store or healthy foods. And so you'll see statewide we have lots of food deserts in greater Minnesota, and then here's kind of the pockets in the 7-county metro area. And so I'm guessing there's some in your region here. And there's been a lot of more research about food deserts and how we can bring food to families, particularly lower income families. Because the other thing about a food desert is the families there, of course, are low income, so they have lack of access to transportation. So actually getting to that grocery store 15 minutes away is very difficult, and actually getting enough groceries for the week is even more difficult when you're taking them on the bus, that kind of thing. And then when we look at housing, children in low-income families who have limited access to affordable housing are more likely to live in crowded housing or become homeless, but they're also more likely to be food insecure and to postpone health care. And about 3,500 children in Minnesota are homeless on any given night, and half of those children are under age 6. And for every 100 families across the country with incomes less than 30% of the median income, which is typically the threshold for getting on a subsidized housing program, there's only 31 affordable and available units. And that's a national number, but it just shows that affordable housing really is not accessible to most low-income families. And this data shows that as well. 1/3 of all children live in households with a high housing cost burden, but 2/3 of low-income children live in a household with high housing cost burden, which means you're paying more than 30% of your income in housing. And then when we look at some of the healthcare outcomes, we do know that a child's health affects their ability to attend and focus in school, and then their social development, as well as their health outcomes as adults. So children who have less access to care as children are more likely to have poorer outcomes as adults. And I was uninsured for a long period of time when I was a child, and thankfully I was pretty healthy, but I never was really able to go to the dentist, and so now I have pretty severe teeth problems, and once I got insurance, I was spending lots of time going to the dentist, getting cavities filled, getting root canals, and thankfully, I missed a lot of work, and CDF is understanding of that, but, and it cost a lot of money, but, so it's just, I think of this personally, how I experienced that. Thankfully, I was pretty healthy overall, but my teeth, not so much. About 6% of Minnesota children are uninsured. Medical debt is the #1 cause for filing bankruptcy, and I think that really shows too that it's not just low-income families that struggle to afford health care or postpone accessing health care due to cost. It's a wide range of families. And then one of the things that reports that I found that I thought was really interesting, and it got a lot of national attention, is when we're talking about Medicaid expansion. In Minnesota, we expanded Medicaid, and of course, we were doing better than most states already anyways in our Medicaid access for children. It's called medical assistance in Minnesota. But across the country, what we found because of the expanded access to Medicaid is it's connected with lower high school dropout rates, increased college attendance, and more bachelor's degrees. So again, kind of that compounding effect on a child's outcomes. It goes in the reverse when we invest in programs and policies that improve their outcomes. And just some data around access to health insurance and then accessing care, of course, which children who are enrolled in health insurance are more likely to access care. And these are young children, so if we look at percent of babies born at a low birth rate, this looks a little deceiving, like it had a huge decline in the last year. But really it went from about 6.5% to 5%. But overall, we are seeing nationally an increase in the number of low birth weight babies, which is a risk for developmental delays later on in life. And one explanation that I've heard is that women are having babies older, so that's just a risk factor for having a low birth weight baby, so that might explain some of the reason why we see the increases. 4% of babies born had mothers who received late or inadequate prenatal care, and about 2/3 of young children are up to date on their vaccine series. And then when we look at childcare, which as you know is one of our focuses this session, we know that increasing access and affordability of childcare is a 2-generation approach to reducing poverty, because then the parents can work while the children are at a safe and consistent childcare environment. And the cost of childcare, of course, is a burden to not just low-income families, but middle and even some higher-income families, as I'm going to learn in a few months here. Minnesota ranked 3rd among states and we had the 3rd highest cost of childcare among states. And I don't remember the other state, but New York had a little bit higher cost. So we're up there with some of those very high cost of living states. And even for families earning the annual median income for families raising children, which is $74,000 a year, their child care expense for an infant is nearly 20% of their income. And the cost of center-based care for an infant annually is more than the cost of annual tuition at the University of Minnesota. So we know that it's very high, and it's you can't take out loans for childcare like you can when you send your kid to college. And then we have about 7,000 families on the wait list, and actually I believe it's more than half of them are in Hennepin County right now. And of course, access to high quality early education puts a child on a path to success. There's even more research, of course, around school readiness in early childhood education, but there's also been research that showed kids who were in a high quality early education setting are healthier as children and then into adulthood. So there's lots of different effects on a child's outcomes. And so, of course, if, it's to be expected, I suppose, that 3- and 4-year-olds not attending preschool, there are higher rates of them if they're in low-income families. 62% of children below 200 poverty weren't in preschool, where about 50% of children above 200% of poverty are not in preschool. Still a high rate for higher income children. And then, of course, because early education, high quality early education is tied to school readiness, when we look at measures of school readiness, the Minnesota Department of Education probably has one of the best measures where they look at 5 different categories. They test children in language and literacy, math, socio-emotional development, the arts, and physical health. And proficiency in all of the categories has been proven to be linked to higher proficiency in reading by 3rd grade. But what we see is that income affects those outcomes, and lower income children are less likely to be proficient in all 5 domains than higher income children. And so another reason to invest in high quality programming for early education for young children who are living in poverty. And then the last 2 sections, transportation and other necessities. What is really important to note about these 2 is there's not much support or programs for families to help them meet these basic needs. For transportation, the cost is very high to own a car. Even if you own it outright, it's $475 for 2 parents with 2 children, just for insurance and gas to and from school, work, and religious activities, and then maintenance. And loan payment would be something even on top of that. And so, but one thing we do know is the programs that are out there that improve access to transportation for families have been known to reduce welfare participation and increase work. So we should invest in these programs because they'll improve family economic stability. And then the other necessities that we include in our budget and ESI and that we're referring to throughout the data book are housekeeping supplies, furnishing, telephone services, clothing, personal care products, and services. So, and with our estimate on ESI, as I mentioned, we don't adjust for age, so we don't include things like diapers or formula or car seats that are very expensive for parents who have young children. So something to consider when you're looking at the graphs that's not included. And then you'll also note on the other necessities page, there's been a lot of research around diaper need, and it's something that we've been looking a little bit more at and trying to figure out policies that will solve the diaper need for low-income families, because what we're finding is it's not only a health risk for the child, but it also has been linked to maternal depression in the mother. And of course, low-income children experience diaper need at a higher rate. And also, there's been findings that it's prevented families from accessing childcare because they have to bring diapers to childcare, and if they can't go. So a solution in California actually was to provide diapers for families enrolled in their childcare assistance program, so that addressed the diaper need and the childcare need. And then the last section again is on assets, and we know that assets are the key to moving out of poverty and enjoying economic stability long term, but it's very difficult for families to develop assets. So about a little over a quarter of Minnesota families live in liquid asset poverty, which means they don't have 3 times the monthly poverty level for their family size. So for a family of 4, they would need to have savings of $5,886 $7 to not be in liquid asset poverty. So it's recommended that you have 3 months worth of your income saved in order to kind of maintain that emergency savings, but liquid asset poverty is just living at the poverty level. 44% of Minnesota consumers have subprime credit. 76% have savings accounts. 4% of Minnesotans are unbanked, and 12.6% of Minnesotans are underbanked. And we do know that families who are unbanked, and typically low-income families, it costs them a lot of money to access their money through money orders and having to go to check cashing places and that kind of thing. And so what this last slide shows are some graphs produced on the Economic Stability Indicator, trying to really show how work support programs and tax credits, along with wages, need to work together to create economic stability and a pathway that's a little bit more linear for families to become self-sufficient. And so what this graph shows, this is a family of 5 in Olmsted County with 3 children, an infant, toddler, and school-age child. And this orange line is they're fully enrolled in all programs. So again, they're accessing child care, Section 8, and energy assistance, even though most families aren't able to access that program. And what you'll see is up in about $1,500. If they're earning $1,500, that's when they're breaking even. They're able to just meet their basic needs budget. And then they have a little bit left over, even up to about $400 at the end of the month to go toward diapers for probably 2 children. So that's going to go pretty quickly. Formula if they need to buy that, debt payments, or any of those other expenses. And then as they earn a little bit more, they'll have a little bit more, peaking at about $600 left over, which still is going to be spent pretty quickly. But what the blue line shows is their net income with tax credits. And it's significantly higher what's left over. Tax credits are given to families when they file their taxes. They're given in one lump sum, as you may know. And it's really an opportunity for families first to meet some of these holes that were in their budget month to month. Maybe pay down debt, to pay up their rent, to make sure their utilities don't get shut off because they're behind on that. And then an opportunity for them to create some savings so that throughout the year they can bridge some of those holes in their budget. But of course, the reality for families is that they're not enrolled in those programs that aren't accessible for most families: child care assistance, Section 8, and energy assistance. And so you'll see here when this family is not enrolled in just those 3 programs, they're enrolled in all the other programs, they're never able to meet their basic needs budget on a monthly basis. So the orange line, they're below the break-even point at every income level, even at $60,000 a year for this family. The tax credits fill that gap then for them. Sometimes they're not even able to fill the gap, but oftentimes they can help them meet those expenses. But really, if we want to use tax credits to their full potential, we need to have families enrolled in all programs. Then they can save and mitigate some of those monthly budget gaps that they have. So that's it for the data presentation. I have a couple slides on our legislative agenda, but are there any questions or thoughts before I go into that? Yeah. I'm not sure specifically what that port was listing, but I know it was they were enrolled in special education at school. So, yep. I know it encompasses all of it, but I don't know at what rate they're in EBD services or developmental. I'm not sure of that. I could see if the study actually had that, but it was just all in general special education. Any other questions or thoughts? Well, I'll go through this really quickly. Again, just to reiterate, all the data is on the data center, so please visit that. And then you can go to our website for any more county fact sheets if you'd like as well. And so what we're trying to do at CDF, of course, is to advocate to improve some of these outcomes for children. and increase family economic stability. And one of our family stories was from Tia, who is a single mother who aged out of the foster care system. You can read her story in the beginning. She aged out of the foster care system into homelessness and became pregnant, but she was connected with Simpson Housing Services and now receives, is able to, her housing has been stabilized. Her child is in a high quality early education program in Minneapolis, and she's working full time, and so she's really a success story. But she also knows that there were programs and policies that supported her on that path to success and continue to support her and her daughter. And she said advocates and politicians should look into real people's lives to understand the urgency of getting people on programs that help. So what we really found was that we could take a 4-step approach to improving family economic security and we put that proposal together and created our Family Economic Security Act, which was introduced in 2009. And it actually came out of the Bipartisan Commission to End Poverty that was commissioned again in 2009. And there was a lot of study done by the Urban Institute that showed how this would not only reduce poverty, I believe, by about 20%, but it would also increase jobs and economic stimulus to our communities. So the 4 pieces of the Economic Security Act are increasing the minimum wage, and we were successful with that last session, as you probably know, and we were successful with $9.50 for large employers, and so that's going to be building up until 2016. It'll be $9.50, and I'm not going to go too much in depth with the details about minimum wage. We do have a slide on it. But what I will say is that the reason CDF was involved with that is because 137,000 children will benefit from an increase to the minimum wage. And so and we know that income improves outcomes, as I've said repeatedly today. So that's why we were supportive of that campaign. And then the second piece, so we got 1 down. We want to fully fund and expand eligibility for the Child Care Assistance Program, and that's going to be our main priority this session, is to fully fund and forecast that program. Not only so we eliminate the wait list, but so that every family can access the program, because what we know, especially in Hennepin County, families don't even get on the wait list because they say it's 2.5 years, my kid will be in school, or I'm never going to be able to access it. So we're going to ensure that every eligible family can be on that program. And then we'd like to see a state version of the child tax credit created. There's just a handful of states that have one now, but it would, recognize the additional costs families have when raising young children. And then we want to expand the working family credit. There were some expansions of that credit that goes to low-income families last session, so we've done a little bit, but we'd like to see it expanded a little more. So building on those successes, our legislative priorities this session are to continue to strengthen the economic security of low-income families, first and foremost by fully funding and forecasting the basic sliding fee child care assistance program. We also want to increase CCAP provider rates. Some of you may know that the provider rates are very low. They're about 20 in the 25th percentile of provider rates overall. So providers who accept CCAP often take a hit for what actually they're paying for that child's care. And so we want to increase those rates and help ensure that more providers will accept CCAP, so when all the eligible children get to be able to be on the program, they can find a provider. And then we also want to expand the child and dependent care credit. You may have heard Governor Dayton talking a lot about this, but the credit actually only is, families are only eligible for it up to like $39,000 a year. So we want to expand that because that's even lower than low-income families. So we want to expand that into middle-income families. And then we want to promote family caregiving by implementing a statewide paid family leave program. And paid family leave, that's not like PTO. Just to clarify, paid family leave is when you have a long-term need to be absent from work to either because you're on maternity leave or you have to care for a sick relative or you're sick yourself. And so that would allow the parent or caregiver to not have to take a pay cut when they have to do that. So it would be a small, probably the proposal is still working out details, but it would be a small tax on paychecks, and typically it would be like 60 cents a paycheck per person, so not very much. And then everybody, regardless of income, could access this program. And then we want to improve the well-being of young children who are homeless or formerly homeless. Some of you may be familiar with Part C, Help Me Grow. People know what that program is. Just to be clear, it's a program for children ages 0 to 3 who are experiencing some sort of, or showing signs of some sort of delay, whether it's developmental, physical, social. They're experiencing some sort of delay. It's for all income levels. And if they get screened and they're showing that they're showing signs of a delay, they can receive early intervention services through Help Me Grow. And that can be speech therapy, physical therapy, emotional therapy, nutrition therapy, and the services happen in the home. And they're paid for through various means by the state. And what we want to do is create categorical eligibility for homeless children to access Part C. Homeless children often experience developmental delays at high rates because of all of the risks and disruption in their lives that they've already experienced at a young age. And so this would mean that a homeless child, regardless, they wouldn't have to go through a screening. If they were homeless, they could receive the intervention services. So that's our legislative agenda. And we just hope that, if any of these pieces appeal to you, or if the data, made you want to take action, that you can join us in advocating in some way at the legislature this session, calling your legislator today. Maybe they're newly elected. I don't think you have any new people in this region, but give them a call, congratulate them on winning, and say, I really hope you can advocate for fully funding the Child Care Assistance Program, or I think it's important that homeless children have access to early intervention services through Part C. And so any other support you need in doing that, we're always happy to support you, but we do hope you can join us at the Capitol, and as well in all the work that you do and you're already doing to improve the outcomes for children.